The Australian Aborigines are, along with the Torres Strait Islanders, the descendants of the first inhabitants of the Australian country and its adjacent islands, and have continued to live there throughout European colonization. Under Australian law, the two peoples constitute the indigenous Australians as a whole. The traditional territory of the Australian Aborigines extends throughout Australia, Tasmania, and some nearby islands. In the first sense of the word Aboriginal, defines the native inhabitants of any country. The term preferably applies to the native inhabitants of Australia. The adjective Aboriginal appears in English since the 17th century at least and means from the origin, derived from Latin. It has been used in Australia to describe its indigenous people since 1789. It soon became a proper name and it was used to refer to all indigenous Australians. It should be noted that in English the use of Aboriginal as a name has acquired negative, even derogatory connotations among some sectors of the community, who see it as insensitive and even offensive, and it tends to be avoided due to the historical associations that people made with it. Also, the word native, which was common in literature before the 1960s, is now often considered offensive. The most accepted term is the Aboriginal noun. Some Aboriginal claim that the use of the English term Aborigines or Aboriginal with a capital letter to differentiate themselves from the Aborigines of other parts of the world and to be recognized as a specific people. This use of the capital letter is typical in English, but it cannot be applied in another language, for example in Spanish. On the occasion of the discussions about the possible inclusion in the Australian Constitution of Aboriginal ancestral land rights, Aboriginal policy advocated in favor of the term Aboriginal and rejected the term Indigenous to refer to the people for being too general. The Australian government, in agreement with the indigenous communities, has used the expression Indigenous Australians since the 1980s to refer together to the Aborigines and to the Torres Strait Islanders, and to distinguish them from the colonial settlers of other origins. The inhabitants of the Torres Strait Islands have a cultural and social heritage and history that differentiate them from the Aborigines. The inhabitants of these islands, particularly in the eastern part of the country, are specifically related to the Papuan people of New Guinea and speak Papuan languages. For this reason, they are not included under the designation of Australian Aborigines. This has been one of the factors that have led to the more generic term Indigenous Australians. There are more than 400 Australian Aboriginal peoples, each with different cultural traits and their own geographic location. They are identified by the name of their indigenous language or by the word with which they call themselves. Among the main ones, we have Kuri in New South Wales and Victoria, Murri in Queensland, Noongar in southwestern Australia, Yamatji in central western Australia, Wankai in the Golden Fields on Western Australia, Noongar South in the Meridional Australia, Anangu in the northern part of the South Australia and in neighbouring parts of Western Australia and the Northern Territory, Arrente in the McDonnell Range, Japa in the Central Northwest Territory, Yolngu in the east in Arnhem Land, Palagua in Tasmania, Jita Jita in New South Wales. What about the languages? Okay. Before European colonization, more than 250 Australian Aboriginal languages were spoken, down to less than 20 by the 21st century, and some are seriously endangered. Some linguists consider that almost all Aboriginal languages are related, although they are distant. Five and classify them into large families. The Pama-Nyunganas and the non-Pama-Nyunganas languages spoken in the north of the country. but due to the difficulty of establishing a clear phylogeny, others consider the Aboriginal languages do not form true linguistic families but constitute a Sprachband, namely a group of similar languages due to their geographical proximity and frequent contacts. Some Aboriginal languages are considered as isolated languages, as in the case of the Twigi language spoken on the island of the same name in the Northern Territory. Regarding the languages of the Tasmanian Aborigines, too little is known to link them. About the astronomy, since Australia's Aboriginal cultures is the oldest of the continuing civilizations, it has been said that Australian Aborigines may well have been the first astronomers in history. Some groups of Aboriginal Australians use the movements of the celestial bodies as a calendar. Religious or mythological meanings are often attributed to astronomical phenomena and celestial bodies. There are many diverse astronomical traditions in Australia, each with its own particular cosmological expression. However, there seem to be common lines between the different groups, such as the emu in the sky or the canoa of Orion. The emu is an animal similar to an ostrich that for many Aborigines they see it on the sky. About the music, the best known of the Aboriginal musical instruments is the didgeridoo or jidaki, traditionally played by men from Arnhem Land and the Kimberley region of northern Australia. This instrument has become popular all over the world and is growing in popularity with the musicians from both traditional music and rock, pop, and jazz. Um, Another unique cultural trait in Australian Aboriginal cultures is the use of the boomerang as a weapon, rather than one-way thrown weapons such as arrows and spears. These together with the ordering to indicate a link with a more cyclical worldview than the rest of the cultures. To present a more linear worldview, even those where their traditional religion is reincarnationist. About the sports, boomerang, throwing a boomerang is the favorite sport for Aboriginal Australians, followed by Australian football, rugby, cricket, and other ones. Since the 1960s, the number of Olympic Aboriginal athletes in different disciplines has been increasing. About the Aboriginal cuisine, the bush tucker designates the set of Australian animal and plant species that allow men to survive in the wild, and their knowledge is an integral part of Aboriginal culture. Food can be roasted either over hot coals and wrapped in crust to be cooked, in oven dogs into the ground. Since the end of the 18th century, the loss of the traditional hunting and gathering territories prevented the Aborigines from preserving their food traditions. On the other hand, the manifest contempt of the European settlers towards this type of diet and the introduction of new non-Aboriginal foods led to the progressive disappearance of the bush tucker, especially in the highly populated areas of the Australian southeast. In the 1970s, various botanical and horticultural studies fueled interest in traditional Aboriginal food and made it fashionable. Starting in the 1990s, it was renamed bushfood and began to appear on the menu of some Sydney gourmet restaurants, and in cookbooks and on culinary television shows. The growing demand for Australians' wild ingredients then led to the creation of industrial crops based on Aboriginal knowledge, without them participating in this new thriving business. Since the beginning of the 21st century, some Australian agencies have been promoting the incorporation of Aboriginal communities in the production and marketing of traditional Aboriginal foods.